Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Center for Humanities Research's Iyatsiba Lab. I'm not going to do a formal introduction. I'm just doing a very quick welcome to say this is UWC, not UCT. So just remember that. We're very happy to have you here and to have our whole panel, Lindalwa Dalamba, who's a senior researcher in the center. She joined us at the beginning of this year. She will do the formal introduction, so I'm not going to jump in. But I wanted to welcome you, let you know that this is a space where we're asking questions around the conditions of the human, what it means to be human in post-apartheid South Africa, and how we can invent new ways of being, whether that's through music, whether that's through philosophy, whether that's through film, puppets, etc. So our building's very quiet at the moment. A large part of our contingent is in Kinshasa at the moment, where they've just started the Herds project, which is a major walk in connection to climate change. 600 puppets that have been built and designed here that are now moving from Kinshasa to the Arctic Circle. So I encourage you to look that up as well. It's called The Herds. And also to apologize for our air conditioning, which broke on Monday. So we will just have natural air, and I'm sure we'll all survive. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Lindalwa to do the formal introductions.
Thank you, Marith. I too am not going to do a complete formal introduction because we've split it with a dear professor, Professor Shahnaz Sofla from the University of South Africa. But I may say that welcome everyone, thank you for coming. Today's program is brought to you by the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape with the Center of Excellence for Black Planetary Studies, the Institute for Social and Health Sciences of UNISA. Okay. The theme for today is Waterlogged Hauntings of the Mediterranean and South Atlantic Oceans. The event today invites us to expand our oceanic imaginaries through temporalities of the slaving and genocidal past and the unrelenting oceanic borderizations and water necropolitics of the present. The seminar today takes us to the waterscapes of Namibia's South Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Ocean. I won't say much more about that, and I would rather introduce Professor Shahnaz Sofla from UNISA to say more about our august speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dalamba, for your opening and for framing for what is clearly going to be an illuminating and a fascinating engagement. No pressure here, the two of you, on the densities of water and memory, on the depths and surfaces of the Mediterranean and the South Atlantic, of the persistent hauntings that reside in water and sand. And I really was very captured by the title of this seminar, as I'm sure many of us here are. So we very much look forward to your talk. But what I want to do first, of course, is introduce our two speakers who will guide us through, I think, oceanic, desert, and knowledge-scapes, yes, and take us to the sites and the sediments of these hauntings that we've just heard about from you, and their necropolitical, their ecological, and their ontological imprints and resonances. So first, I introduce you, Professor Edwige Tamalet, and I've been told that I've got the pronunciation right. Thank you. I worked on it. Is a New Orleans-based literary and theory scholar working at the intersection of Maghrebi literature, Mediterranean studies, and the environmental humanities. She is Associate Professor of French and affiliate of the Environmental Studies Program and the founding director of the Middle East and North African Studies at Tulane University in the USA. She is the author of many, many highly acclaimed texts and is currently working on several projects that examine borders, and migration from the standpoint of water specifically, water as an epistemological site. She is, I'm very pleased to say, recently appointed as a professor extraordinarius at the UNISA Institute for Social and Health Sciences. It's really our pleasure and a privilege to welcome you to the seminar space, but to South Africa. Welcome, a warm welcome to you. And then my friend and colleague, Professor Hugo Canham, is a writer and professor at the Institute for Social and Sciences, Social and Health Sciences at UNISA. He directs the Center of Excellence for Black Planetary Studies. He studies the phenomenology of Black life at the margins of what he would describe as human value of suffering, of death. He too does really, really interesting, limit-pushing scholarship and community engagement, and when you read about his work, you'll understand what I'm talking about. His book, titled Writers' Deathscapes, is published by the Duke University and co-published by Wits University. He has another book in the pipeline, and I'm sure many more subsequently. My introduction of Professor Canham won't be complete without me telling you, and he's not going to particularly like this, but he just won a highly, highly prestigious book prize for the book, Writers' Deathscapes, which was conferred by the Academy of Science of South Africa and presented last night in Johannesburg at a rightly honoring ceremony. So congratulations from us all. With that, I'm going to hand over to you.
I'm going to focus on 3 material forms, which are water, corals, and sand. Right? I see these as ways into histories of genocide and its intimate relations to pasts that in moments appear out of reach, but are always present, right? And I pause on 2 sites, which is on the South Atlantic. The 2 are Clifton Beach, which is not far from where we are, and the second is Swakopmund, that one would reach by driving, sailing, or flying up the west coast. From here all the way to southern Namibia, you'd first probably pass Ludwig and then Swakopmund, near Walvis Bay. Habiba Badurun, a great scholar of the Cape, asks us to turn to the ocean to think about what we see when we look at the ocean. More recently, she's been writing a poetry book on sand, which she suggests has been a neglected material in ocean studies. It is the less sexy cousin of water. It's brown, water's dazzlingly green and blue, transparent, black, and all of those things. So I'm going to talk of a project I'm currently working on. To take her injunctions seriously and to think about water and sand together. After all, water rests on sand. When we go to the ocean, those of us who can't swim, we spend more time on the sand than in water, but I think even swimmers are not unaffected by sand. We return home with sand clinging to our bodies and our clothing. It is carried in the wind. Much of the Cape Flats, including where we are today, was once the ocean. What is left of it, with geological change, land clamations from the ocean, is sand. Old pictures of this area, is this parallel to Salt River and them? Yeah. Show that this space, old beaches here that people would go to visit. You can find these even on social media. Today, sitting in this room, we likely occupy what was once the shoreline. The castle down the road is unmoored from its old water tether, right? And it was doing very specific work on the ocean. Those from the Cape Flats proper, further down, languish on wind-swept sand where very little grows. Describing the Cape Peninsula, Badarun observes that it is 30 meters deep in sand blown from the sea for millennia. We stand on geological ground and sedimented layers of deep time. 1,000 years ago, this was the seabed. We are sand, she says, and sand is history. Sand distributes, holds. Sand is form, and it is archive. In both cases of Clifton, here in Cape Town, and Swakopmund in Namibia, I attend to the bodies disposed or killed in or along water masses. And I do this through reading the water and sand for how we might think with the African deathscape and its technologies of refusal. As we've learned from the Over Herero and the Nama genocide carried out by the Germans in Namibia, the colonial apartheid state in South Africa, murderous regimes destroy and curate what we see in the archives. To circumvent and augment the gaps in these archives, we turn queerly to the ocean, which was a formative way of knowing the colonial world, because that was the major form of transportation and encounter and relation. To know differently, the natural world provides planetary scripts of being and knowing. An existing body of work tells us that human remains can reside in the ocean and other water bodies for centuries. For instance, in South Africa, at the mouth of the Classes River, human remains such as postcranial, facial pieces, upper jaws, and teeth were dated back to the Middle Stone Age. At Little Spring in Florida, the US, an extensive range of primitive human remains, including vertebrate and invertebrate fossils, were found preserved. The skeletal remains of enslaved people and those murdered in genocides litter the sea and riverbeds and form part of the coral skeletons among rocks and coral reefs. To read corals as entangled with human bones enables what Tiffany Letabo King conceives of as conceptual and methodological disturbance. I seek to apply Isabel Hofmeyer's conception of the Indian Ocean as method to Namibia, a country whose location in the South Atlantic is lost in the American and Caribbean facing histories of the ocean, because to tell histories of slavery, the Caribbean scholarship and North American scholarship have been doing this work, and they often turn to West Africa as the place of relation, and very little to the South Atlantic. To orient towards water complicates nomenclature and enables us to think with those not recognized as human and whose deaths were therefore not apprehended as death. Arriving on the Atlantic seaboard at Clifton Beach, the home of multimillionaires, one will be forgiven for seeing only the beauty of the mountain slopes plunging into foaming blue sea. Here glass houses, greedy for light and sea views, cling to the rock. This is a kind of paradise on genocidal grounds where indigenous populations were exterminated for this land. However, the work of maritime archaeological divers shows our visions of paradise. In the shallows of the raging waters, divers found, just in 2014 or so, 15, remains of the Sao Jose Paquet, a slave ship that capsized in 1794, just 50 or 60 meters from the shore. While its captain and crew about half of the captives were rescued, 212 enslaved people drowned. This ship was from Ilha de Mozambique en route to Brazil. We know Brazil to be the biggest black diaspora in the world. After Nigeria, it has the biggest population of black descendants. When it got to Clifton, strong winds wrecked it off the coast just 24 days into its 4-month voyage. According to Boshoff, an archaeological diver here at Izego in Cape Town, a group of multi-country divers, in the debris of the ship, they argue that this is the first ever ship definitively identified as a slave ship. Very often you can do archival matching with approximations of where a ship might have gone down, or the ship cannot be linked to a specific destination. In this case, they were able to do that. This ship is the soggy symbol of the confluence of the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic slave trade, right? People taken from Mozambique along the Indian Ocean, entering the Atlantic from Cape Town and about to travel all the way through to South America. It compels us to attend to the water in ways that destabilize our history has compartmentalized the oceans. Hofmeyr again tells us that the Southern Ocean slave ship itineraries trouble the northern bias of how slave histories are told. Those approximately 200 waterlogged people who did not drown in the cold Clifton waters are likely to have been herded to the slave lodge, which is not far from here, and market within days of the shipwreck. There they would have joined several hundred others in the Cape colony's thriving slave market. Cape historians have placed the number of enslaved people at little more than the settler population soon after the turn of the century. So enslaved people were more in number than the settler population. The image up here is of the divers diving off Clifton Beach. These maritime archaeological divers take us below the surface in ways that literary scholars and historians rarely can. Since I can neither swim nor dive, when I met Jaco Boshoff at Izego Museum in 2022, I was in search of a first-hand account of going below water. Boshoff and his associates' account of ways through underwater wreck provides insight to the physical difficulty of being submerged underwater. They tried for many, many months to do this work. And we can imagine people floundering off this ship that's wrecked, which is not far from the shore. A strong swimmer, I think, would have easily swum to the shore if they knew where it was. As an ontological archive, the sea can be a place of death, but when aided by wind, rock, sandbanks, and ancestral spirits, it is a space of refusal. When the ship sank, it cost the lives of Africans, but it also exerted a financial toll on the Portuguese slavers who commandeered it. Upon finding the remains of the wreck, archaeologists examined them through passing threads of history. Remains included slave shackles that had since been freed of the eroded wrists and bones they once held. On my visit to the Izego Museum offices where Boshoff works, I saw tables bearing artifacts and scientific agents in various states of use. Nancy Child, an artifact conserver who worked on the wreck, told Piet van Niekerk and Werner Hoffman that conserving the slave shackles was difficult because of the advanced water corrosion and hard sediment on the shackles. I liken the hardened sediment to the process of coral concretion, which enmeshes more than human and the human. Boshoff and his team found 3 sets of shackles: iron ballast, used to trade in slaves and to counterbalance the weight of human cargo on the ship, and a portion of the hull in the water. He hoped to find human remains with continued work on the site. Speaking to The Guardian, he pointed to the 2 rocky reefs that nestle the wreck site. These reefs make dredging difficult. However, from what we know about reefs, They clearly absorb matter into themselves, and then through exposure and flaking, they disperse in the water and wind in geological time. For now, we must imagine the more than 2-century-old bones as entangled with the sea detritus, feeding the kelp forest as sand and as part of the rocky corals on the ocean bed, among the boulders that stretch out in the water. If you know those at Clifton Beach, the boulders that we see. Boshoff and his North American peers, Mozambican descendants of the enslaved and South Africans, participated in a form of ritual return. At the conclusion of the ecological work, they hosted a memorial service to symbolically reconnect the drowned at Clifton Beach, the place of capture, at Ile de Mozambique, these two sites. On 30th of May 2015, the Makua elders from Montreal arrived in Cape Town for a ceremony bearing a jar of sand taken from northern Mozambique. Telling the story of the Mozambican ritual soil, Lonnie Bunch of the Smithsonian, who went to meet with Envano Ngokashe, the highest ranking Makua chief in northern Mozambique, observed that the chief told him, "Take the soil from our community. I want you to take the soil to that wrecked place where the ship, that wretched place where the ship went down, that our ancestors know that we are still here. In a sense, I want you to bring those people back home." In this leap of freedom, once deposited over the shipwreck, after 2 centuries, those who died there would eventually be able to sleep on their own land, the warmer sands of the Mozambican shore. Argot Jones reveals the power of sand by suggesting that it simultaneously contains geological memories in its elemental structure and calls forth referential memories from its color, its feel between the fingers, and quality of grain. The Makua chief knows the power of sand. The gesture of sending sand from Mozambique to the site of the wreck is an evocative connection to its geological memories of those who walked the sand, which is also to say the sand retains its knowledge of enslavement and is saturated with things endured. Those sent to dive the wreck would have touched the sand and felt its freighted past. And those that dredged the water and dug up the sand to unearth debris from the shipwreck looked for forensic traces in sands that witnessed the wreck more than 2 centuries ago. In its molecular structure, the sand gives us a queer reading of history. If corals develop through concretion with surrounding matter, sand is flaking and wearing of matter into smaller particles. Stone, corals, shell and bone breaking, slow erosion. Sand is wear and tear that bears the imprint of local geologies of things done. In the undertow at Clifton Beach, the sand clung to the wreck. How are we looking? If you can go to the next. Yeah, thanks. So a poem by a Namibian anti-genocide activist, whose name doesn't appear because of the format here, but he writes this poem called "The Sea Can't Swallow Me." My bones resting at sea bottom, fish feast on my flesh. You thought I would be forgotten, but the salt of the sea keeps my bones fresh. The sea can't swallow me, the sea and I are one. One bright day, the waves will wash my bones ashore. In my children's memory, I stay. The sea can't swallow me, the sea and I are one. From trawling the scholarship of the Middle Passage, we know that the Atlantic is replete with bodies. To this Atlantic scholarship, I add the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Heather Davis describes those lying in the Atlantic as bubbles of eyes watching, brain coral receiving these new arrivals. Since sodium from human blood can last for millions of years, and skeleton remains fused with corals, we can imagine the Ovo Herero and Nama as memorialized and existing as living dead in the coral bed. ancestors that refuse death by holding on to living things in the water. Corals provide a record of enmeshed planetary history. For Davis, and I quote, "The commingling of the ocean and air, earthly and watery beings, is an assertion of the sentience of bodies and of our radical dependence on the sentience on the other. Coral human beings, despite attempts to transform them both into brute matter." In Swakopmund, that I went to, on the night that I arrived there to conduct research on the concentration camp just off the in Swakopmund, during the genocide there, I awakened several times to puke, to throw up, ngenhla nangezansi, as my mother would say. The next day, my body was dehydrated when I stood before the forlorn genocidal memorial at the old cemetery. My sports watch, this one, complained that my stress levels were too high. I was reminded of the fever that struck me when I visited Zanzibar for similar work. The boundary between the dead and the living is porous. The dead infect the living. As a person in search of the dead, my route had edged the portal of death. Death had entered my gut and left me dry. In the windswept cemetery along the dry riverbed, many hundreds of tiny mounds in the desert earth dot the landscape. Each has a few stones which have moored the graves in place across a century. Like miners claiming mineral finds by piling rocks and stones, those who care for the dead keep stones on their graves as a way of tethering them to the living. The sand cannot be trusted since it swarms with the shape-shifting might of the desert. And these are examples of these little clumps that along the Swakopmund River runs just below in that before those trees. Vanessa Argott-Jones observes that sand exists at the point of nature's hesitation between land and sea. But as Swakopmund shows us, sand can also be desert land. Every year, Leilard Pariganda, Overarero genocide activist and Swakopmund Genocide Museum curator, leads a group of volunteers to gather the sand into mounds. They rake it up every year, this work of gathering this thing that's always trying to move. In this covering and uncovering, sand is a historical preservative that demands that we return to the fragments of the dead. Caribbean writer and photographer Nadia Huggins presses on the liquid similarities between sea and sand and describes the former as the liminal space between land that humans can inhabit and the uninhabitable sea. The Swakopmund sands heave with death. Their habitability appears more hospitable to the dead than the living, but even this is a precarious habitability since the dead move with wind and water. Leila Priganda, the guardian of genocide's dead, is a man possessed. When I spoke to him, it was apparent that he was haunted by his great-grandmother's spirit. It is she that he referenced when he talked about why he does this work. Ancestors such as his great-grandmother were imprisoned, worked and starved to death in the port and railway construction camps of Swakopmund. The site of their open-air prison is where their bodies were buried in shallow graves and where their souls haunt the shores. He sees himself as the conscience of his people and this town. He publicly insists on the present connection to the horror of more than 120,000 people killed here in the period 1904 to 1907. While busloads of German tourists train their cameras on the dramatic deathscape and the flamingos and pelicans that loiter in the bay, the cemetery is desolate. Skeletal remains are occasionally exposed by the wind. Apart from him, a few committed others, and the shifting sand, there is no one to see them. I too avert my gaze, but the fever of the dead has caught me. A walk from the cemetery takes me to the jetty. Peringanda tells me that at the jetty, people often jump to their death rather than wait for their inevitable death by starvation, torture, and illness. Perhaps this is why people still jump there when they no longer want to live, he tells me. There is sadness there. Jack Bolton, a writer on Swakopmund, for him, the suicide deaths might be seen as spectral forces in the deathscape of the jetty that impact the living. The jetty, he says, is a chameleonic structure which connects history with the future and the living with the dead. Close quotes. The only other people not infected by the sadness of this place appear to be its thriving German and Afrikaner communities. They eat and drink at the restaurants on the jetty and crisscross the terrain of the high-rise vehicles meant to conquer the surrounding desert and ocean. Henrietta Gunkel writes that while people drive over unmarked graves and bring the splinters of the dead to the surface, this is the paradise that their forebears murdered people for. Their ancestral genocidaires unhumaned and depopulated this place to bequeath it to them. As overlords, they continue to enjoy it, while those like Peringanga live in the famished sandy plains of the informal settlements. Here, like sand, black impoverishment is endemic. It is everywhere. Watching the water at the bay, I'm struck by his resolve, the determination with which many black Namibians walk, and the knowing stillness of the flamingos. In the ripple of the water, I wonder if there is a ring of ancestors and water deities holding the hands just below the surface. Swakopmund is on a uranium belt. Uranium mining is the leading industry of the town. Based on accounts of those who mine the mineral, Bolton characterizes uranium as monstrous for its rapacious appetite to eat those it comes into proximity with. But what if the dead also eat off the mineral, I ask? Perhaps the bones of those killed and buried in the uranium earth are now uranium spirits who draw their power from the nuclear-saturated earth and waters. If nuclear can power naval vessels, electrify whole cities, and dispose of cities as well, it may be capable of holding up the chins of Namibians in the present. Like corals, maybe uranium, water, and sand constitute the spiritual and material forms of those murdered in the killing fields of Swakopmund. The wind, the morose rock, desert sand, lapping water, and coral debris on the seafloor retain the deadly knowledges of this place. Thank you.
You thank our wonderful guests here at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape, and the Center of Excellence for Black Planetary Studies at the Institute for Social and Health Sciences at UNISA. It is my pleasure to be here, my pleasure to be affiliated with you, and a true honor to be speaking today. There will be a lot of overlap with everything that Professor Canham has been beautifully evoking for us. In my own presentation, I will move the focus to the Mediterranean from the South Atlantic, but I operate on the assumption that those dynamics are recurring throughout history, and that they obey the same kind of material and ontological dynamics that were found in the slave trade. And so I will focus today on what has been called a new Middle Passage in the Mediterranean, but really this material focus, elemental focus that we have been discussing will also be animating my own reflection. So we'll see a really nice arc of concepts and histories throughout our two presentations. Before I take us down to the level of the shore, so I gave a title to my remarks today, Thinking from the Shore, Waterlogged Materialities. Before we start discussing the shore, I wanted to spend a few minutes to talk a little bit about waterlogged, this concept of waterlogging and what it means, how we can understand it critically, etymologically. And I wanted to start by reflecting on the origin of the word itself. So, to be waterlogged, in a way, is to be saturated with water in a state of ponderation, both physical, as in body carrying extra weight, the weight of water, but also epistemological, weighing in the mind, taking the time to carefully assess and interpret. It is to enter a state of quasi-elemental change under the weight of water, to make oneself malleable, permeable to water infiltrations, to accept its insinuations into the very fabric of being. If I could get the next slide, the next one. Still, okay. It is to adopt this materialist heuristic put forward by Melody Joy and Rafiko Ruiz, an attitude of ontological openness, wherein the researcher does not know all the substances, elements, agencies, or processes in advance, but rather explores what may co-saturate in a given situation, end quote. It is, in other words, to accept new ontological coordinates, to subject oneself to the stress of this taxing relationality, and I'm talking here about the co-saturation, the co-element in this co-saturation, as in together, in tandem, though not necessarily in equal measures, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So in a word, it is to open oneself to the gravitational pull of water to the point of what I call exposure, by which I mean self-dissolution and reformation, but here to be understood in a material sense of a drowned human body, that of a cross-Mediterranean migrant marooned in water, that will be dissolved into the deep sea and mutate through human and more than human assemblages. So, if we can move on to the next slide. Here is an early mention, one of the earliest mentions, in fact, of the word waterlogged in hyphenated form, which can be found in 1769 Universal Dictionary of the Marine, penned in London by a William Falconer, who defined the term as follows. Waterlogged, the state of a ship when, by receiving a great quantity of water into her hold, by leaking, etc., she has become heavy and inactive upon the sea, so as to yield without resistance to the efforts of every wave rushing over her decks. As in this dangerous situation, the center of gravity is no longer fixed, but fluctuating from place to place, the stability of the ship is utterly lost. She is therefore almost totally deprived of the use of her sails, which would operate to overset her or press the head on the water. Hence, there is no resource for the crew except to free her by the pumps or to abandon her by the boats as soon as possible. End of quote. Waterlogged then stands in reference to maritime crossings, some of them of the most sinister kind. And I'm thinking of the slave ship, obviously, with this trope of the hold, when the hold of a vessel becomes so saturated by the aquatic element that it loses any ability to chart its course, as it lies inert, overwhelmed by the agential might of the watery substance, powerless to resist its pull. And this in turn brings to mind the jettisoned enslaved bodies fed to the destructive waters of the Atlantic in the primal scene of maritime trauma in the Atlantic, destined to be reactivated throughout the course of Western maritime modernities the world over. And of course, the illegal migration crises, so-called crises that we have been witnessing in the past 20, 25 years in the Mediterranean, but also elsewhere between Cuba and the United States, for instance, or between the Comores and Mayotte in the Indian Ocean, are reincarnation of this original paradigm. So waterlogged then would mean to have lost control, to have lost agency, the ability to keep one's autonomy and separateness from the engulfing watery element. There is one last possible meaning to the term that I would like to tease out, and that is waterlogging as logging in water, logging through water. Logging here taken in the scriptural sense of the term as a travel log, a record of sorts, distances, ports of calls, for instance, precisely the kind of log produced and disseminated during the sinister voyages at sea that the mention of the ominous hold in the 1769 text suggests. So a log of water, a log inked with water, very much like the ship's itinerary, traced on the surface of water, a material scriptural pendant to its intangible mark, may be a log that operates at the deeper level than the ocean surface. A log reconstructing the many unfoldings of submarine activity that form part of water's full deployment. A log diving into the ephemeral, the non-temporally anchored, a waterlog pondering water, ponderating it, recording what is doing itself as a force in the making of histories. So if we think about waterlogs now in relation to this idea of haunting, we need to attend to specters of histories, of lives and trajectories altered by the course of water in a recurring movement of saturation that erases the tension and the limit between body and sea, between self and water, between history and the poetic word. Posing the question of the haunting permeating water, then, is to adopt a strategic emplacement as critics at the crossroads between water's opaque density and the God-eye view of historical narrative. It is positioning oneself as an interpreter of traces, of remnants, of signs, as a go-between between fact and the ineffable on the sideline of history. It is to be steeped into water's dynamic and yet sufficiently removed to bear witness. It is to find one's footing on the edge of water in an epistemology infused by water while escaping the dissolutive pull of maritime churning. In the theoretical trappings of my intervention, this is what I call tarrying on the shore. Can we move on? Thank you. So let's talk about the shore now, what I mean by that. The shore is first and foremost a liminal space, as we've discussed already, following its constitutional premise as a line of demarcation, a point of contact between destabilizing maritime forces and terrestrial political orderings, a porous boundary between land and water. The shore is a space of intermingling and mutual infringement. In other words, it's a terraqueous transition zone where material permeability spurs unexpected, imaginative juxtapositions and radical epistemological shifts. My reflections draw inspiration from the ongoing tragedy of migrant deaths in the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The vision that animates my thinking is one where these drowned bodies fall prey to the violence of voracious waters. They drift onto Maghrebi beaches, transforming the Maghrebi seascape into a haunting tableau of grotesque human precariousness. Bodies tumefied, partially decomposed, blended in with sand, seaweed, and marine life. And we've had those resurgences from the sea that have become part of the collective unconscious on Mediterranean beaches, those ghastly discoveries which have inspired a body of literature, a body of filmic representations, as well as artistic production. Landscapes have been known to point to overlaid arrangements of human and non-human living spaces. I want to suggest that the deadly seascapes that are conjured in this talk are similarly concerned with complex forms of human, more than human imbrications. Seascapes are formed by the corrosive power of natural elements, mostly seawater, but also, as we've seen to some extent, by sand. By harboring these gruesome encounters, the shore mediates an ontology of bodily exposure, marked by bodily disintegration and reformation, one where the human and non-human commingle into a dark form of intimacy. This convergence highlights the fundamental porosity of shores as sites of perpetual turbulence and ontological transformation. It also mediates the unique vantage point that they purview. Shores are shaped by the enduring tension between human engineering and elemental agency. They reverberate with the cascading crises that have come to characterize the Anthropocene. The shore is both unstable and vulnerable on account of the erosion that it sustains. The beach pulsates with a rhythmic swirl of accumulated sediment. Figuring renewal and fleetingness, its fluidity gestures towards endless material restructurings. It recalls the syncopating rhythm of the tide. In these undulations, various materialities collide, ushering in complex orders of ontological disturbance. On the tide line, seawater voraciously laps the land, revealing its friability at the interface between nature's might and human efforts to contain it. This liminality weaves together new forms of embodiment. It shows more capacious definitions of life, combining biological and non-biotic life forms, or in other terms, and in an echo of Professor Canham's presentation, bone and rocks, fossils. So to get back to the original premise of the short line then, we will ask a few questions, which I have put here on the slide. Where does one medium, water, begin, and the other, land, end? Where exactly can one situate these points of tension between land and water? And most important, perhaps for our peregrinations today, what impact does this tug of war have on the materialization of borders and the regime of exclusion that they perpetuate? My focus today lies on specific sites of devastating hydropolitics, on Mediterranean flashpoints where water, as a corrosive element, becomes an agent of life and death, a necropolitical force that substitutes itself for the state, so in this context, supranational Europe, by allowing migrant life to prosper or by exterminating it. Water enacts borders vertically. The shore, in this case, intervenes as a staging site to witness the monstrous outcome of deadly biopolitical practices perpetrated by exterminating states to lend shape to it. And I believe I have a couple more slides. This one is just the Mediterranean sea route that I will be indirectly referring to today. So we see them running the whole gamut of the Moroccan, Algerian, Tunisian coast. So this is what I call the Maghreb, the northwestern part of Africa, making their way to Western Europe. But there is another route now, even more prominent, through the eastern seaboard of Turkey, Greece, in fact, coming from Asia. So this is the part linked to Africa, but it's only half of the picture. And if I could get the second one. Yes, okay. So here again, we have some additional data and key figures. Thank you. So here's the process then that surrounds the submerged bodies of the migrants who perish during their ill-fated maritime journey to Europe. Left to die at sea, their bodies are anonymized, turned into sheer molecules, into matter. They cannot even claim the fate of entombment in the maritime cemetery. In fact, the very nature of water and its endless planetary circulation functions as a principle of this dispersal. Once deceased, these bodies are left to decompose in the elements. They're dissolved through the corrosive effect of seawater, dispersed and amalgamated into their marine environment, disappeared from view and bereft of proper memorialization. The subaltern in post-colonial theory, the slave in biopolitical thought, or the drowned migrant at the bottom of the Mediterranean abyss, all of these figures incarnate an objective position that scrambles the divide between subjectivity and objectivity that anchor notions of personhood. Against the deceit of unified subjecthood, the becoming residual of these migrants ushers us into the realm of objectification. As Achille Mbembe has written in Necropolitics, that the slave condition results from a triple loss: loss of a home, loss of rights over his or her body, and loss of political status. This triple loss is identical with absolute domination, natal alienation, and social death, expulsion from humanity altogether, end of quote. These deaths partake in the category that the order of capitalist modernity has designated as, quote unquote, waste, to borrow Zygmunt Bauman's epithet, a classification that includes both human and more than human life. The hegemonic space-time of transatlantic modernity unfurls over drowned enslaved bodies. Today, the new migratory Middle Passage in the Mediterranean resurrects excruciating dynamics of submersion, where sacrificial bodies are eliminated in the name of ideology. So in the days of the slave trade, profitability, and industrialization, today neoliberalism and national sovereignty in the case of Europe. How then to attend to these inscrutable processes, to these ontological mutations? Waterlogging occurs by definition in the hidden depth of the ocean, removed from sensory perception. While some subjects view the sea as a surface for leisure or travel, others, particularly marginalized migrating populations, perceive it as a dangerous expanse hiding perilous depths. For those unable to cross it safely, the ocean becomes a site of death and suspension, its deceptive flatness masking the tragedy beneath in a grammar of recurring death and haunting extermination. I would like to argue that adding depth to our understanding of the ocean recasts it from a metaphorical surface into a material immersive substance, seawater. Surface-level narratives emphasize borders, flows, and surveillance, the tools of empire and capitalism. Seawater, in this view, becomes a medium of global circulation and modernist ideology. It reflects fluidity, interconnectedness, and the abstraction of identity. However, a focus on depth introduced concerns of volume, of substance, degradation, and geological time. Immersion in seawater destabilizes fixed identities and terrestrial certainties. It calls for denaturalizing the ocean as mere metaphor and embracing it as a material force that redefines subjectivity through affective, sensory, and bodily experience. The sea becomes a haptic zone where bodies dissolve and blend with a more than human aquatic world, a perspective which is echoed in indigenous understandings of the ocean as a space of contact and relation rather than separation. This water emerging complicates the boundaries between human and non-human, between self and other. The ocean does not merely envelop, it corrodes, absorbs, and transforms. Deborah Bird-Rose describes this interface between sea and body as a space of ontological intimacy and disintegration. Franklin Ginn adds that such encounters are not meetings of bounded entities, but contaminating entanglements that produce residual compounds, blurring lines between the organic and inorganic. So to critically engage with seawater is to acknowledge its corrosive materiality and symbolic force. It requires challenging Western notions of autonomous subjectivity and embracing vulnerability, fluidity, and interconnectedness. Thinking through seawater means redefining the human, not as exceptional or separate, but as humus, as Donna Haraway suggests, that is amorphous, interwoven matter involved with other forms of life and matter. This reframing calls for ethical engagement with our co-constitutive others and willingness to be transformed by unfamiliar assemblages. This is what I call tarrying on the shore. The reverberating stories conjured by the appearance of decomposed migrants on Maghrebi beaches invite an interruptive approach to the shore. They put pressure on critical paradigms rooted in this space and urge us to create new perspectives attentive to the material fragmentation of conventional modes of dwelling, but also a fragmentation of our habitual models of thought. Thinking the liminal space of the beach as precarious seascape reveals its intrinsic vulnerability and exposure, its fragmentation and permeability. The beach staging these tragic encounters is notable for its porosity, its material entwining with what I have described as dissolutive ontologies, that is, a form of immanent multiscalar manner of being in the world, an ontology of dissolution premised on loss and decomposition that blurs the discrete categories of subject and object into an enmeshed form of intimacy. It is a form of being in the world tuned in to ongoing rockings of currents and swells, the unfurling of waves, the timing of oceanic pulsations, one that Anest Singh says is best understood through immersion in many small and situated rhythms, minor contingencies, asymmetrical encounters, and moments of indeterminacy, end of quote. Maritime landscapes are thus to be parsed vertically in the depth of their anthropogenic sediment. As a sign of deep history, this minerality reveals the hyperconnectivity tying and placement on the tideland to the longue durée planetary and geological dynamics. The figure of the drowned migrant catalyzes this compression in scale, and the world-making project that it sustains. So does the critic, attending to this compression of temporalities when tarrying on the shore. By attending to the ineffable encounters between bodies and geological forces, a shore-level critical perspective reveals a geography of annihilation that binds all forms of objective life. The liminal landscape of the shore solicits our affective imaginations as embodied viewers, inviting us to delve deeper into the tactile textures and material afterlives of decay at the margins. The shore is both threshold and layered surface. The lacerated forms of life that it cradles reveal the density of literal spaces. It highlights their role in elucidating the interlock crisis intrinsic to our era. Be it in the maritime depth or on the literal edge, precarious seascapes are a measure of our deep alienation. They also offer an avowal that life in the margins always implies ontological vulnerability to non-human others. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
There was something quite familiar about taking the sand home. Because when you're in Johannesburg or in somewhere that's landlocked, people say, please bring some sand from the beach. And today I actually have a better reason for why that happens. And I thought it was very beautiful about the rituals of return. There were so many beautiful things. And at least there, read or heard in dialogue with Edwige's paper, at least those guys had an opportunity for return, an opportunity for some kind of closure, which, as Prof. Edwige has said, a lot of the migrants crossing the Mediterranean do not have that luxury in a way. So thank you for that.
I suppose if I were to look at it, a tiny dot, what kind of scale am I imagining here, you know? When you say that the South Atlantic, yeah? There's a South Atlantic off the coast of Latin America as well. So I'm trying to imagine what scale are we talking about? What is this distance? What is this depth, you know? And what I find really interesting, especially the comments made about the Mediterranean and Clifton, is how capital seems to seek out these spaces on which, like, to cover this death with the perception of beauty, you know, and I find that quite interesting.
You spoke about the second presentation about artistic productions of what has happened with on the shores, and I wonder if you could elaborate on these artistic productions and, you know, their kinds of their formations and the kinds of mediums they take. And linked to this question is artistic productions here with regards to S.S. Mendy particularly. I don't know if anyone here has seen or has witnessed some of the productions by Mandla Mbotwe from Michaela's school, where he's put on, for the past couple of years now, a number of productions, and the last one I went to, or the last two I remember particularly, where he called it Intlombo Yezinqi Zomendi. And this is like an ongoing production, articulated in different ways in different years, but he excavates, right, that history and brings it into, you know, the university halls, as it were. And so I'm really interested in the kinds of, and in fact, speaking about ritual and sand, even in those productions, right? He brings sand, he brings, you know, things that are related to the sea, and of course, sitting here at the CHR, we're always interested in arts and the artistic productions and how we think about these through the arts. And I wondered if you could speak a bit about those. Thank you.
There was something quite familiar about taking the sand home. Because when you're in Johannesburg or in somewhere that's landlocked, people say, please bring some sand from the beach. And today I actually have a better reason for why that happens. And I thought it was very beautiful about the rituals of return. There were so many beautiful things. And at least there, read or heard in dialogue with Edwige's paper, at least those guys had an opportunity for return, an opportunity for some kind of closure, which, as Prof. Edwige has said, a lot of the migrants crossing the Mediterranean do not have that luxury in a way. So thank you for that.
So in Riotous Deathscapes, you have that shipwreck, and you pick it up here in another sense, right? So shipwrecks are important. And what you're talking about there, I said, oh gosh, I go to Clifton Beach. I haven't been there in a long time, but I go there, and here is something I didn't know at all about that I don't know how to respond to that, to memorialize that space that's now so bourgeois. So here's the thing about the question. So the people in Macau who bring the soil and want to memorialize their people, are you already writing about where the sea ends, where the water ends, could extend as far as the Macau, is, in one sense, the sea in Clifton Beach could, So the simpler question here is this: in this work that you do from Clifton Beach, Swakopmund, I suspect you might be doing this in your running and going away unexpectedly from South Africa. So do you go there to do the work, to meet these people there? That's the first thing. And I guess you could say the same thing then about, and then of course the castle of Good Hope, not so Good Hope, and then go to Brazil, to this destination that the people were going to. Are you doing that? I mean, that's a simpler question about the itinerary of your thinking, about whether you follow these routes of the people who were enslaved. And the second part is in that way where you're tracing the movements of the ship, the water, the sand. I wanted to say something to Hugo. I know I know you are not particularly keen about this discipline where you were trained, in which you were trained, and you're more black studies. That's why I wore a T-shirt for you, so I can ask this question. It is precisely this kind of work that is so out of the discipline in which we are trained that how I understand the kind of this thing that I call psychology, this African psychology, if you will, which traces the subjectivities that follows the water, that doesn't just think of you as this person who is here, has no history. Do you want to say something about that as well, please?
So this is something that you find in the context of multiple crossings. Coco Fusco, for instance, in the Caribbean, Latin American context has produced art about this. There is art produced also in the Horn of Africa about drownings themselves. There are literary representations. There are many different media. A few figures maybe that I can highlight. One is the revenant, so the ghost, the one that comes back, the suppressed, submerged presence that is coming back to somehow try to right the wrong or try to be heard, try to lodge a kind of a process of redress, which will be enabled and implemented by other figures around him. I'm thinking of Mati Diop's film Atlantics, for instance, which you might have heard about. That's one of the tropes you have there. You have this in literature as well, this return. So the idea that something endures in water, that is not just material, but there is a spirit, and then the spirit of the spirit that has been wronged, and the spirit that needs to somehow reclaim existence, subjectivity, recognition, post-mortem as a sort of beyond the grave dynamic of return, another ritual of return in a way. So we have this, which is a prevalent figure. Another thing is the submersion in water itself, and contemporary art has been working a lot on the ship, because obviously that's the easier element to represent. It's the question of representation. How can you represent something that by definition is invisible, that by definition taps into orders of being that are far in excess of what we can conceive, right? Because you have this human, what constitutes the humanity of those drowned migrants, which somehow morphs into something else. So it's very hard to even contemplate from our own positionality as bounded humans. And so there are various techniques or approaches that can be put into place here. One is to focus on water itself as an element. And so you have a lot of filmic works, for instance, a few camera work that goes underwater, and then you work with this kind of submersion, what it means, and then you have either drowning migrants, people fighting the element, and then the elemental quality of water is put to the fore. There's one wonderful example and I have the name here, Dagmawi Yimmer, for instance, as Matt, I can give you the reference later, who has this short where we follow a crew of migrants in Eastern Africa. And then the moment where they capsize and what happens. And so sound here actually is very interesting and important. The sound of water, there's a materiality to it as well that is evocative of the kind of drownings that are happening. But you're really focusing on the silence and the disappearance surrounding the event rather than the event itself. So it has to be very evocative, right? It cannot be representational in a figurative way. It has to be a lot more lyrical, a lot more poetic. I think an important distinction too, and I'll stop with this, but we can discuss more of this later, is the distinction between representations and appearance. I think that representation in this case would be seen as a coercive practice where you basically co-opt, appropriate what's happening, right? And so inflict a certain type of violence on it. While the idea for a lot of those artists who are also militant is to give those migrants or those bodies the ability to appear, and we're going back to this idea of the revenant, right? It goes to needing to be re-embodied, perceived. And so having this ability to just be, to appear in a way that allows for this ontology to express itself. So it's finding, towing this thin line between a coercive mode of representation and then allowing for those figures and those dynamics to emerge, to appear on their own.
Yeah, the scale question, right? I think in some ways directed at both of us around the Mediterranean. My presentation and even the current work is doing this tracing from Mombasa, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa, Namibia. And this is like quite a big geographic range, but it's also so incomplete because these movements are global, right? So Brazil has this really intimate relationship to Mozambique and to Angola. And it's really where you choose to focus or what's possible, but both the kind of horizontal scale and the vertical scales are very layered, sedimented geologically. And that's why I sometimes find the elemental form, the materials, as the thing that's graspable because so much else is is gone in some ways, not gone, but not visible. And so in the parts where I focus on Mozambique, there's this really clear diasporic relation, in part because it's also the strange thing about colonization, because Mozambique and South Africa are really intimately interwoven, both geographically in relation to before we even had borders, but the linguistic imposition of Portuguese, of English, right, just creates the schism that when they are thinking artistically, when they're thinking about diasporas, imaginaries are scattered to these faraway Portugal and Brazil and perhaps Angola and Cabo Verde, and I think there's one more on the continent, but not here. And yet, the slave trade in South Africa, Mozambicans were a dominant group. Fun Mozambique. If you go to the slave, what is it called? Here, Izigo, outside Izigo, the museum, you'll find those little memorials, and there are these little poles with names. Many of them are Fun Mozambique, actually. But also how we imagine histories of enslavement in the Cape, right, tend to be scattered into faraway diasporas, which is correct, but what that often does is disappear very proximal ones. Getting carried away from the actual questions. Swakopmund, you should go. Just take medication in case your body reacts as mine did. So, I mean, the last image that I had on my thing was that it was from last week. This year's been a very rainy year, both in the region and in Namibia as well. Namibia, a very dry country. And for the first time since, this is the remark on the social media thing, that the Swakopmund River has reached the ocean tonight for the first time since 2022. And this is a celebration. Along that river is exactly where the camps were, right? It's where these shallow graves are. In this moment of the river reaching the ocean is also this movement of the sand, of the shallow graves into the ocean, right? So the question of the arts, I see the arts as these compulsive, if you think of this one that you're talking about, the SS Mendy one, as repetition, right? That the artist continues to remake it and expand it and restage it and exhibit. This compulsive returns, ritual returns, traces to something that one is almost compelled to do, and that's the nature, I think, of ritual. But these sand rituals you're talking about, carrying water from in my coastline in the Eastern Cape to inland parts of, right, are forms of ritual enactments, about these stubborn traces of history and the accretions over time and sediments that we have to do to live. And I think the artist is doing something there in order to live. So my work has these strange itineraries, right? And that I sometimes trace when I'm allowed to travel, because there's also that, because you're doing tourism. These strange itineraries are exactly these movements that racial capitalism use as a mode of extraction of people, resources, etc. That we often are unable to trace, because for these very reasons, that it's, what are you doing? What are you doing? Where are you going to Namibia? But necessary kinds of work, right? Which are African psychology, Kopano. Exactly that. And an umbrella that's really important, but whose shadow just stops at my feet. In terms of, I see it, but the term psychology and its history is so freighted that the freedom of elsewhere's sounds more compelling for my particular work.
I think I want to extend thanks, but a deep kind of thanks to the two of you, and for this space. Am I not? That's very kind of you. For very powerful, very moving, very evocative and critical contributions and provocations across oceanic depths, across desert lines, across geologies of loss and memories, across the difficult but very, very vital work, clearly very vital work of listening to what water carries, what sand carries, what water and sand refuse to forget. And much more than I could capture here. You heard from from the audience, the ways in which your contributions have moved us, and how they've been received in our and through our many senses, affectively, in our bodies. So really, thank you very, very much for that. And so crucially, and I think you all started to talk about this towards the end, so crucially, well, not the end, really, it was embedded in your presentations. At a moment when the rot and the savagery of empire is so present and threatens in a multitude of ways, but I'd also I like to believe in the impending collapse of empire. I'm going to be optimistic. That what you do and what you share and what you produce is so, so important. And it's not just a scholarly enterprise. Listening to the two of you, it is so not just a scholarly enterprise. Yes, it is about insurgent knowledge making, but it is a kind of, and I'm going to draw on what you were all saying about reckonings. I think it is an insistence through hauntings, through beckoning hauntings, through resurrecting, an insistence on reckonings, both minor and major, and even as I say minor, they're not really minor, are they? So thank you very much for that. Thanks to you. I'm not done. I want to thank you. Thank you for your very dynamic and thoughtful facilitation. Certainly gratitude to the UWC Center for Humanities Research for agreeing to co-host this event, co-create this event in a very, very special place. I need to look around some more. Umesh Bawa, in his absence, he's the director of the UWC International Relations Office, for supporting this event that in a most critical way. Of course, to the UNISA Institute for Social and Health Sciences team, and particularly to the Black Planetary Studies research team for the planning and for the arrangements. And of course, to all of you. You have, well, thank you first for joining us today. Thank you for the way in which you have been present. Thank you for your openness. And it's not just an intellectual openness that you brought to today's conversation and engagements. We really, really appreciate that. So I'll end by saying, may we continue to hold these submerged and sedimented histories with care. May they move us towards deeper solidarities, sharper refusals, Prof. Hugo, and expansive reimaginings of our planetary entanglements. Go well, but before you run away, I know that there's a photograph that's wanted. Thank you, everyone.